The knife left Glacia Darkwolf's belt before the first insult finished leaving the Border Lord's mouth, and it buried itself in the treaty table an inch from his knuckles, quivering. "Speak my husband's name like that again," she said, "and the next one finds your throat instead of the wood." The crossroads town of Bramford Ford went silent around them. Merchants froze mid-haggle at their stalls. A dozen guardsmen shifted their grips on spear shafts. Behind Glacia, 3 orc riders from the Ashfin clan sat their horses with hands resting easy near axe handles. And behind the Border Lord, 20 human soldiers in the colors of Havingard tightened into a wary line. The morning market noise, the lowing of oxen, the clatter of cartwheels, the cry of a tinker hawking pots, all of it died at once, leaving only the flap of canvas awnings in the wind and the soft, terrified breathing of a stable boy who had frozen halfway across the square with a bucket in each hand. The Border Lord, a heavy-set man named Aldrich Voss with a face reddened by wine and sun, did not move his hand from where the blade had nearly taken his fingers. His eyes were wide, his jaw working, but no sound came out. It was David Ramsay who broke the silence because someone had to, and because it was, in the end, his job. "Lady Darkwolf." His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was simply how he spoke, low and even, the voice of a man who had spent 7 years in a cloister learning that shouting rarely solved anything. But it carried across the square all the same, because everyone wanted an excuse to breathe again. "That knife is currently the property of Lord Voss's negotiating table, and I am afraid the Treaty Commission does not have funds allocated to replace furniture." For one terrible heartbeat nobody laughed, and David wondered if he had just gotten himself killed by 2 different armed camps at once. Then Glacia Darkwolf turned her head and looked at him properly for the first time, and something in her yellow-flecked eyes shifted surprise mostly, and something sharper underneath the surprise that he would only later learn to call interest. She was, David thought distantly, the most striking person he had ever stood near. She stood a full head taller than him, built like a warrior who had spent a lifetime swinging steel rather than a quill, with skin the deep green-gray of river stone and black hair bound back in a thick braid threaded through with small iron rings. Each one a mourning token, he would learn, for a fallen kin. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and well-oiled, lace tied up a torso corded with muscle, a leather bodice that cinched at her waist before flaring to protect her hips, with vambraces strapped along both forearms and a short sword and hand axe belted at either side. There was a scar along her jaw, thin and old, and another disappearing beneath her collar, and none of it made her less beautiful. If anything, the scars sat on her like proof that beauty and danger were not opposites in this part of the world, merely 2 names for the same fire. "You," she said slowly, "are either the bravest man in this square or the greatest fool in it." "I am told the 2 are frequently confused," David said. "I try not to worry about which one I am on any given day." A ripple went through the crowd, not quite laughter but something loosening. Lord Voss finally found his voice, thin and furious. "She threatened a lord of Havingard in open market. I want her in irons." "You called her dead husband a savage who deserved his grave," David said, still in that same level tone, though something had hardened underneath it now, something Glacia noticed and filed away. "In front of witnesses, at a treaty meeting meant to prevent more graves being dug. If anyone owes an apology here, my lord, I do not believe it is the widow." The Border Lord's soldiers muttered. The Ashfin riders behind Glacia said nothing at all, but their stillness had teeth in it. David Ramsay stepped between the 2 sides, a slight man, unremarkable in most crowds, brown-haired and plainly dressed in the gray and brown wool of a treaty clerk, no sword at his hip, only an ink-stained satchel of papers slung across his chest. He had left the monastery at Aldwych 5 years ago, because he had grown tired of praying for peace from behind stone walls, while men bled for want of it in the world outside, and he had spent every year since trying to make himself useful in small, unglamorous ways, translating grievances, drafting fair boundary lines, standing quietly between people who wanted to kill each other until the wanting cooled enough for words. He was 29 years old, and until this morning he had believed himself very good at being forgettable. He was not forgettable to Glasha Darkwolf, not after this. "Everyone," David said, raising his hands, palms out to both sides at once, "is going to put their weapons away, and we are going to finish this meeting like people who would like to still be alive for supper. Lady Darkwolf, if you would be so kind." He held out his own hand toward the quivering knife. For a moment she only looked at him, weighing something. Then, with a small huff that might almost have been amusement, she reached past him, plucked the knife free of the wood with a single clean motion, and slid it back into the sheath at her hip without breaking his gaze. "You have nerve, little clerk," she said. "I have not decided yet if that is a virtue or a death sentence." "I have been told it is often both," David said, and this time when the crowd laughed it was real laughter, and the terrible tension of the square cracked just enough to let everyone breathe. That was how it began, not with courtship, not with kindness, but with a knife in a table and a quiet man standing unafraid between two furious peoples, because it was, quite simply, what needed doing. The border dispute that had brought them all to Bramford Ford was, on its surface, a simple thing. A strip of grazing land along the Kestrel River, claimed for generations by the Ashfin Orc clan for their herds, now wanted by the expanding farms of Havingard for wheat. Simple things, David had learned in 5 years of treaty work, were never actually simple. Underneath the grazing rights lay 40 years of war scars, a massacre at Thornfield that neither side had forgotten nor fully told the truth about, and 100 smaller griefs like the one still raw in Glasha Darkwolf, her husband, Karg Darkwolf, killed 8 months past in a border skirmish that both sides blamed on the other and neither had properly investigated. She had come to Bramford Ford not as a diplomat but as a witness, dragged into the negotiations because the Ashfin elders needed someone who had stood at Karg's grave to speak for the dead, and because Glasha herself would not have stayed home even if they had forbidden her. She had come armed because she trusted the humans of Havingard exactly as far as she could throw their border lord, which, given her strength, was actually a fair distance, but not nearly far enough for her liking. David had come because the Crown's Treaty Commission needed someone who spoke both the trade tongue and enough of the Ashfin dialect to translate honestly, someone patient enough not to flinch when both sides screamed, and someone expendable enough that if the talks collapsed into violence, the Commission would not mourn too deeply. He had not asked for the last part. He had simply noticed over the years that it was true, and made his peace with it the way he made his peace with most things, quietly and alone. The treaty table itself sat in the middle of Bramford Ford's central square, a long trestle of rough-hewn oak dragged out from the trading post for the occasion, flanked by canvas awnings to keep the worst of the sun off the parchments. Around it, the crossroads town carried on its restless business caravans rolling in from 3 directions, dust rising off wagon wheels, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer from a forge at the square's edge, hawkers selling dried meat and river fish and bolts of dyed cloth, a dozen different tongues tangled together in the noise. Bramford Ford existed because it had to. It was the only crossing point for 50 miles where the Kestrel ran shallow enough for wagons, and so every people who wanted to trade, travel, or simply survive in this stretch of the borderlands eventually passed through its dusty streets. It made an uneasy piece of necessity, orc traders haggling beside human merchants, dwarven tinkers repairing wagon axles for coin from anyone who paid, and beneath all of it, always, the memory of the war that had ended only 1 generation back, close enough that old hatreds had not yet had time to properly cool. It was into this town, this crossroads of wary tolerance and old wounds, that Glasha Darkwolf had ridden 3 days past, and it was here, at this trestle table under canvas shade, that she now sat down again across from David Ramsay, her knife back in its sheath, her eyes still bright with unspent fury, and found herself, against every instinct she owned, unable to stop looking at the quiet man who had stood between two armies without so much as raising his voice. The negotiations resumed that afternoon, tense and slow. David sat at the center of the table, papers spread before him, a plain iron pen in his ink-stained fingers, and did the only thing he knew how to do well. He listened, and then he found the narrow ledge of common ground between two furious speeches and stood on it until both sides had somewhere to put their feet. The grazing rights along the Kestrel Bend have belonged to the Ashvin since before your grandfather's grandfather plowed his first field, said Elder Grum, the aging orc who led the Ashvin delegation, his voice a low rumble. We do not ask for charity. We ask for what is already ours. And my farmers have starved through 2 hard winters waiting on wheat that could grow in that same soil, Lord Voss snapped back, his fingers drumming near where the knife had struck. Land does not belong to whoever grazed it longest. It belongs to whoever can feed the most mouths from it. Land, Glacia said, low and dangerous, belongs to whoever is willing to die for it. My husband died defending that river bend. Ask him who it belongs to. The square held its breath again. David set down his pen. May I offer something, he said, and waited until both sides grudgingly nodded. The Kestrel Bend is wide enough to support both a grazing herd and a modest wheat planting, if the herd rotates to the northern bank during planting season and returns south after harvest. It would require both sides to trust the other to keep to the schedule. I understand that trust is in short supply here, but I have drawn the boundary lines myself, walked the land myself, and I believe it can be done fairly if both sides are willing to try. He unrolled a hand-drawn map, ink still faintly smudged from his own hasty measurements taken over the past week, and set it on the table between them. Glacia leaned forward to study it, and so did Lord Voss, and for a long moment neither said a word. You walked the land yourself, Glacia said finally, not quite a question. I did not think it fair to draw lines on ground I had never touched, David said simply. Maps drawn by men who never leave their desks tend to get people killed. Something in Glacia's expression changed then, not softened exactly, but sharpened into a different kind of attention, the way a warrior looks at another warrior instead of at an obstacle. You are not what I expected of a treaty clerk, she said. I am not what most people expect of anything, David said, and there was no self-pity in it, only a kind of tired honesty that made her want, absurdly, to laugh. The talks did not resolve that day, nor the next, but they did not collapse into bloodshed either, and in a place like Bramford Ford, that alone counted as a victory. That evening David found Glacia alone at the edge of the river, sitting on a flat gray stone with her boots off and her feet in the cold current, her sword laid across her knees more out of habit than expectation of danger. He almost turned back rather than intrude, but she had already heard him. Orc ears missed little, and did not look around. Come to translate my silence into something the border lord will find diplomatic, she asked. I came to see if the widow who nearly took a man's hand off this morning had eaten anything since, David said, and held up a small cloth bundle. The inn has decent bread and better cheese, and I did not think you would accept charity from Lord Voss's kitchen even if it were offered. Glacia turned to look at him properly then, and something in her face guarded, always guarded, he would come to learn, eased by a fraction. Why does a human clerk care whether an orc widow eats? Because I have watched you glare at everyone at that table for 2 days like you are waiting for a reason to draw steel, David said, sitting down on the stone beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance. And I have found in 5 years of this work that hungry people find reasons faster than fed ones. She studied him for a long moment, the fading light catching the iron rings in her braid, and then, wordlessly, took the bread. Karg would have hated you, she said around a mouthful, and there was no malice in it, only a strange, raw fondness for the dead. He hated clever men, said they talked circles until you forgot what you were angry about. Is that a compliment or a warning? I have not decided, Glacier admitted. Ask me again when I know. They sat in silence for a while, the river murmuring past, lanterns beginning to glow in the windows of Bramford Ford behind them, and David found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, not lonely. Tell me about him, David said quietly. Your husband, if you want to. Glash's jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought he had overstepped, that she would rise and walk away and the fragile thread between them would snap before it had properly formed. But she did not move. He was loud, she said finally. Loud and reckless, and he laughed too much at his own jokes. He died defending that river bend from raiders who were never proven to be Having-Guard men at all, though everyone assumed it, because assuming is easier than investigating. I have spent 8 months wanting someone to pay for that, and I still do not know who deserves the debt. She turned her head, met his eyes, and there was something fierce and unguarded in her face that struck him harder than any blade could have. I did not come here for a treaty, clerk. I came here because I could not stay home and do nothing while men decided the value of his death over a piece of parchment. Then let me help you find the truth of it, David said. Not the treaty's truth, the real one. I cannot promise it will bring him back or ease the grief, but I do not think either of us will feel right walking away from this table with only half an answer. Glacia looked at him for a long, searching moment, as if trying to find the trick in his offer and failing to locate one. Why would you do that, she asked, when it is not your grief to carry? Because, David said slowly, I have spent most of my life watching other people's grief from a careful distance, and I am tired of it. I would rather stand close to something true, even if it burns, than keep standing safely far away from everything that matters. Something shifted in the space between them then, quiet and enormous, the way weather turns before a storm anyone can see. Glacia did not smile, she rarely did, not yet, but the hard line of her shoulders eased, and when she finally rose to pull her boots back on, she paused and rested her hand briefly against his shoulder, warm and heavy and startlingly gentle for a hand that had thrown a knife into solid oak that same morning. Bring your maps tomorrow, clerk, she said. We are going to walk the river bend ourselves, and you are going to tell me exactly where your treaty commission thinks the truth lies buried. She left him sitting on the stone in the dark, his heart going far faster than a treaty clerk's heart had any business going, and it was a long while before he trusted himself to walk back into town. The next morning they rode out together before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, Glacia on a broad-shouldered gray warhorse bred for orc war camps, David on a sturdy but decidedly unglamorous bay mare borrowed from the commission's stable. They followed the kestrel north along the disputed bend, past scrubland and stands of birch, until the land opened into the wide grazing meadow that had cost Karg Darkwolf his life. It was here, walking the grass with the river's murmur beside them, that David began to notice the details that a rushed report from either side had missed: a scorched patch of ground too far from any known campsite, wagon ruts leading away from the meadow that matched neither Ashfin cartwheels nor Having-Guard farm wagons, an old arrowhead lodged in a fence post that bore no clan markings at all. These are not Having-Guard arrows, David said, crouching to examine the fletching, his voice sharpening with the particular focus of a man who had finally found a thread worth pulling. The fletching is wrong. Having-Guard soldiers use goose feather, dyed blue for the border regiment. This is raven feather undyed. That is a mercenary's mark, or a raider's. Glacia went very still beside him. Someone wanted this to look like Having-Guard's doing. Someone wanted a war, David said grimly, and used your husband's death to light the fire. It was that discovery, small, unglamorous, the kind of careful groundwork no glory-seeking soldier would have bothered with, that first cracked something open in Glacia's guarded heart. Not because it proved Having-Guard innocent. The border lord's soldiers were far from blameless in the decades of cruelty between their peoples, and Glacia would never fully forgive that history. But because David Ramsay, a quiet clerk with ink-stained fingers and no sword worth the name, had ridden into contested, dangerous ground beside her not to manage her grief, but to actually chase the truth of it, patient and thorough and utterly unafraid of what the truth might cost either side politically. "You did not have to find this," she said, turning the arrowhead over in her broad palm. "The treaty would have gone forward regardless. Nobody at that table asked for justice, only land." "I did not do it for the treaty," David said quietly. "I did it because you deserve to know." Glasha looked up at him then, and the distance between them, the caution, the old hatred, the careful negotiator's neutrality David had worn like armor for 5 years, all of it seemed suddenly very thin and very unnecessary. She closed the space between them in 2 strides, caught the front of his tunic in one strong fist, and kissed him hard and sudden beside the river, fierce as a challenge, gone again almost before he could believe it had happened. "That," she said, breathing hard, eyes bright with something that was not quite anger and not quite tenderness but some new, dangerous mixture of both, "is not because you are a good diplomat, clerk. Do not mistake it for that." David, stunned and grinning despite himself for the first time in longer than he could remember, said, "I will try not to." "See that you do not," Glasha said, and swung back up onto her horse before he could recover his composure fully, though the flush on her green-gray cheeks betrayed that she was not nearly as unaffected as she wished to appear. They rode back to Bramford Ford in a silence charged with something entirely new, and if either of them noticed the other stealing glances the whole way home, neither said a word about it. The arrowhead changed everything, and nothing, in the way that half-answers so often do. David brought his findings to the treaty table the following day, laying out the evidence carefully before both delegations: the mismatched fletching, the unclaimed wagon tracks, the scorched ground too far from any legitimate campsite. Elder Grum studied the arrowhead with a deep, weathered frown. Lord Voss, to his credit, did not dismiss it outright, though David suspected that was more from fear of Glasha's temper than any real conversion to honesty. "If this is true," Lord Voss said slowly, "then someone wanted war between us badly enough to spend a man's life buying it." "Someone still does," David said. "A treaty here does not just cost farmers grazing land or clan herds pasture, my lord. It closes a door that certain people would very much prefer stayed open. I would advise increased caution, not less." He was right, though he would not learn how right until 3 nights later, when Bramford Ford burned along its northern edge, and the fragile peace he had spent a week building nearly died in the flames. It began at midnight with a scream from the stockyards. David woke in his rented room above the trading post to the smell of smoke and the clang of the town's warning bell, and by the time he had pulled on his boots and stumbled into the street, half of the northern grain stores were already burning, orange light licking up into the dark sky, sparks scattering on the wind toward the thatched roofs of the market stalls. Chaos ruled the square. Merchants dragged carts of goods away from the flames. Guardsmen shouted contradictory orders. And through the smoke, David saw a knot of armed men, not Ashfin, not Havingard regulars, but rough mercenaries in mismatched armor, cutting through the crowd toward the treaty tent, where the signed drafts of the boundary agreement were kept under guard. "They mean to destroy the treaty," David realized aloud, and without stopping to think whether it was wise, he ran toward the tent. He arrived just as 2 mercenaries dragged the elderly guard away from the entrance, and without any weapon beyond his satchel and his own foolish courage, David threw himself between them and the canvas flap, spreading his arms. "Those documents are the only thing standing between this town and open war," he shouted over the roar of the nearby fire. "Burn them, and you condemn 1,000 people on both sides to die for a lie someone else already told once." One of the mercenaries laughed and raised a club. David braced for the blow, jaw set, refusing to move, and the club never landed, because Glasha Darkwolf came out of the smoke like something out of an old war song, her sword already drawn, and put herself bodily between David and the mercenary's swing, catching the blow on her vambrace with a crack of leather and bone-jarring force. "Touch him," she snarled, "and I will paint this square with what is left of you." What followed was fast and brutal, and entirely too close for David's comfort. Glasha fought like something ancient and furious, her sword a blur in the firelight, driving the mercenaries back from the tent step by bloody step while David, heart hammering, dragged the fallen guard clear and shouted for the town watch. More Ashfin riders arrived within moments, drawn by the commotion, and having guard soldiers too, and for one strange, terrible minute the two forces that had spent the entire week glaring at each other across a treaty table fought side by side against the true enemy men who wanted their peace to fail. It was over almost as quickly as it began. 2 mercenaries lay dead, 3 more fled into the dark, and the fire, though it claimed a grain store and 2 market stalls, was contained before it could spread to the rest of the town. David stood in the smoke and the aftermath, hands shaking now that there was time to notice, and found Glasha standing over him, blood on her blade, her chest heaving, staring at him with an expression somewhere between fury and terror. "You absolute fool," she said, her voice cracking in a way he had not heard from her before, fierce and warrior-proud as she was. "You stood in front of armed men with nothing but paper and your own stubbornness." "I could not let them burn it," David said, still catching his breath. "Not after everything it took to get both sides to trust it even a little." "You could have died," Glasha said, and there was real fear underneath the anger now, raw and unhidden, the fear of a woman who had already buried one man she loved and could not bear the thought of another grave. "Do you understand that? You could have died right there, and for what parchment?" "For peace," David said quietly. "For you and Elder Grum and every farmer and herder who does not deserve to bleed for someone else's ambition. I would do it again." Glasha stared at him for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind her eyes, and then, heedless of the crowd still gathering around the smoldering wreckage, she pulled him against her and kissed him, not fierce this time, not a challenge, but desperate and searching, her hand fisted in the front of his shirt as though she could hold him there by will alone and keep him safe from every future fire. "Do not do that again," she murmured against his mouth when she finally pulled back, forehead resting against his. "I have buried one husband already. I refuse to bury a second man I have only just started to want." David's breath caught. "Started to want." "Do not make me say it twice, clerk," Glasha said, though the fierceness in her voice was undercut by something soft and unmistakable in her eyes. Around them, the town of Bramford Ford began the slow work of rebuilding what the fire had taken, and David Ramsay, standing in the ashes with an orc widow's hand still gripping the front of his shirt, thought that he had never in his life felt so entirely, terrifyingly alive. The days that followed the fire brought both delegations closer to an actual signed agreement, driven by the shared understanding that whoever had sent those mercenaries would try again if they were given time. Elder Grum and Lord Voss, for all their history of mutual suspicion, found unexpected common cause in hunting down the truth of who wanted their peoples at war, and David worked from dawn until well past dark drafting revised boundary lines, verifying testimonies, chasing down the mercenaries' trail through Bramford Ford's tangled network of traders and informants. Glasha stayed close to him through all of it, not because Elder Grum ordered it, though he did, wary of another attack, but because she had made a decision somewhere in the smoke of that burning night that she was not willing to examine too closely yet, except to know that she did not intend to let David Ramsay out of arm's reach if she could help it. It was during one of these long working evenings, in the lantern-lit back room of the trading post, where David had set up his makeshift office, that the rivalry between them tipped over again into something breathless. "You have redrawn this boundary line 4 times, Glasha said, leaning over his shoulder to study the map, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, smell wood smoke and leather and something underneath that was simply her. "It is the same river. The land has not moved." "The concerns have moved," David said, trying and failing to keep his focus on the ink rather than the woman looming, warm and solid, at his back. "Elder Grum wants a wider buffer near the fording point. Lord Voss wants the wheat fields closer to the water for irrigation. I am trying to satisfy both without making either side feel cheated." "You worry too much about fairness," Glacia said, and there was a teasing edge in her voice now, something lighter than the grief and fury she had carried into Bramford Fort a week ago. Carg used to say a good compromise is one where both sides walk away slightly annoyed. If everyone is happy, someone did not read the terms. "That is a deeply cynical way to draft a treaty," David said, laughing despite himself, and turned his head to look up at her, which was, he realized too late, a mistake, because it put her face only a handspan from his own. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The lantern light caught the scar along her jaw, the fierce intelligence in her yellow-flecked eyes, the small, unguarded curl at the corner of her mouth that he had learned over the past days to treasure the rare sight of. "You keep looking at me like that," Glacia said quietly, "and I am going to stop pretending I have not noticed." "Like what?" David asked, though his voice had gone rough and he already knew the answer. "Like I am something worth looking at, instead of something to be managed and placated at a treaty table," Glacia said. "Every human I have known who was not Carg looked at me like a weapon or a threat." "You look at me like," she stopped, frustrated, searching for words that did not come easily to a warrior more used to actions than confessions. "Like you are the most remarkable person I have ever met," David finished for her, quiet and certain. "Because you are, Glacia. I have spent 5 years standing at the edges of other people's lives, useful and forgettable, and then you threw a knife into a table, and I forgot how to be forgettable at all." Glacia made a low sound in her throat, something between a growl and a laugh, and closed the last small distance between them, kissing him slow this time, deliberate, her hand coming up to cradle his jaw with a gentleness that startled them both. When she finally drew back, they were both breathing unevenly, and the treaty map lay forgotten and slightly crumpled beneath David's elbow. "This is a terrible idea," Glacia murmured against his mouth. "An orc widow and a human clerk. My clan will not understand it. Your commission will not sanction it. It could unravel everything we are trying to build here." "Probably," David agreed, though he made no move to put distance between them. "I have never been very good at doing the sensible thing when it mattered most." "Good," Glacia said fiercely, and kissed him again. Their courtship, such as it was, unfolded in stolen moments between the urgent, exhausting work of building a lasting peace. A shared meal snatched between negotiation sessions, a ride along the river at dusk to clear their heads, a quiet hour by the forge fire while the blacksmith's apprentice pretended not to notice how close together they stood. It was not gentle or slow, not really. It crackled with the same intensity that had brought them together in the first place, arguments over treaty language sliding into heated kisses, a disagreement over how much to trust Lord Voss's latest concession ending with Glacia pressing David back against the trading post wall, both of them laughing breathlessly between kisses at how thoroughly they had abandoned the argument. But it deepened too, in quieter moments. Glacia told him, one night by the river, about the small orc village where she had grown up before it was burned in the old war, about the years afterward spent as a warband scout, because a woman with nothing left to lose made an excellent one, about meeting Karg on a raiding trail and choosing, against all her own expectations, to build something soft and lasting instead of continuing to burn. David told her in turn about the cloister at Aldwick, about the years of silence and prayer that had taught him patience, but had also, slowly, hollowed something out of him that he had not realized was missing, until she filled it back in with her fierce, unexpected presence. "Why did you leave the cloister?" Glacia asked him one evening, her head resting against his shoulder as they sat together on the riverbank, the stars coming out cold and bright above the crossroads town. "Because I prayed for peace for 7 years and never once left the walls to help build it," David said. "I decided I would rather be useful and afraid than safe and useless." "That," Glacia said, tilting her head up to look at him, "is the least monk-like thing I have ever heard a former monk say." I was never a very good monk, David admitted. I think I always knew somewhere that I wanted a life with more in it than quiet contemplation. I simply did not know what that life was supposed to look like until a week ago. Glash's expression softened in a way she rarely allowed anyone to see, and she reached up to trace the line of his jaw with careful fingers, as though he were something precious and slightly unbelievable. I did not come to Bramford Ford looking for this, she said quietly. I came armed and furious and certain I would find only more reasons to hate the men on the other side of that table. I did not expect to find you. I am glad you did, David said, and meant it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life. Not everyone shared their happiness. Word of the widow and the clerk spread quickly through Bramford Ford's tangled gossip, and reactions split predictably along old, bitter lines. Some of the Ashfin writers muttered that Glasha dishonored Carg's memory by taking up with a human so soon, though Elder Grum, to his credit, said nothing against it, having seen enough grief in his long life to know it did not follow anyone's expected timeline. Some of the Havingard soldiers made crude remarks about orc widows and human clerks that reached David's ears eventually, second-hand, and which he chose, mostly, to ignore, though the set of his jaw when he heard them told Glasha plainly enough that the words had landed. It came to a head 5 days after the fire in the crowded market square during the busiest trading hour, when a Havingard soldier named Corbin Hale, drunk on cheap wine and old prejudice, shoved David hard enough to send him stumbling into a fruit cart, scattering apples across the dusty ground. "Careful, clerk," Hale sneered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Word is you have taken to warming an orc's bed. Did she threaten you into it, or did you just get lonely enough to lie with a beast?" The square went quiet in that particular, dangerous way it had before, merchants and travelers turning to watch, sensing violence in the air. David straightened slowly, brushing dust from his sleeves, and for a moment said nothing at all, simply looking at the soldier with an expression that was not anger but something colder and steadier. "You may insult me all you like, Corbin," David said finally, his quiet voice somehow carrying further than the soldier's shout had. "I have been called worse by better men, but you will not speak of Lady Darkwolf that way again in my hearing, or anyone else's." "Or what?" Hale laughed. "You will write me a strongly worded letter." It was not David's fist that answered him, though David's hands had curled at his sides. It was Glasha's voice, cutting across the square like a blade, as she strode out from beneath a nearby awning with a stillness that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Or," she said, stopping a pace from Hale, close enough that he had to crane his neck to meet her eyes, "you will answer to me, and I promise you that will hurt considerably more than any letter." Hale's bravado wavered visibly. "This does not concern you, orc." "You made it concern me the moment you laid hands on him," Glasha said, and there was a warning in her tone that made even the watching guardsmen take an involuntary step back. "I have killed men for less than what you just said, soldier. Do not mistake the treaty table for mercy. It has simply not yet been tested against you." For one taut moment, it seemed the whole square might erupt again, soldiers reaching for hilts, Ashfin riders shifting closer, the fragile peace built over the past week hanging by a thread thinner than a bowstring. It was David again who stepped forward, this time not between two armies but simply beside Glasha, his hand finding hers and gripping it tightly in full view of the entire market. "There will be no bloodshed over an insult," David said, loud enough now for the whole crowd to hear, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Lord Voss, I trust you will discipline your man for conduct unbecoming a soldier of the crown during an active peace negotiation. And I would ask everyone here on both sides to remember why we came to this table in the first place. Not for pride, for peace. And peace does not survive men like this one feeding it insults instead of respect." Lord Voss, who had arrived at the edge of the crowd in time to hear the worst of it, looked genuinely furious, not at David, but at his own soldier, whose behavior threatened to unravel a fragile agreement Voss himself had begun, grudgingly, to want to see succeed. Corbin Hale, Voss said coldly. You are relieved of your post and confined to quarters until I decide whether to send you home in disgrace or simply flog you in the square as an example. Get out of my sight. The crowd began to disperse, the tension bleeding slowly out of the square, and Glasha turned to look at David, her hand still tight around his, something fierce and proud and openly adoring in her expression that she made no effort at all to hide. You did not have to defend my honor with words alone, she said. I am capable of defending it myself. I know, David said, but I wanted the whole square to see that I am not ashamed to stand beside you, not for the treaty's sake, for yours. Glasha's throat worked, and for a moment she said nothing, simply pulled him into a fierce embrace right there in the dusty square, heedless of who watched, pressing her face briefly against his hair. You are a strange, brave, foolish man, David Ramsay, she murmured. I think I am beginning to love you for it. It was the first time either of them had said the word aloud, and it settled between them like something solid and true, impossible to take back and neither of them wanting to. 3 days later, everything they had built nearly burned down for good. It happened at night without warning, the way disasters in border countries so often did. David woke to Glasha's hand shaking his shoulder, urgent and hard, her voice low and tense in the dark of his rented room. Riders, she said, many of them coming from the East Ridge, and they are not flying any banner I recognize. By the time they reached the town's edge, the alarm bell was already ringing, and the eastern approach to Bramford Ford was lit by torchlight. A war band, perhaps 60 strong, mounted and armed, cutting off the eastern road with the clear intent of encircling the crossroads before dawn. David's stomach dropped as he took in the scene. These were not Havingard soldiers or Ashfin riders. They wore no clan colors, no crown insignia, only dark leathers and raven-feathered arrows that David recognized with a sick lurch of memory from the meadow by the Kestrel Bend. The same men who killed Karg, Glasha breathed, her hand tightening on her sword hilt. Or their masters finally showing themselves. Word spread through Bramford Ford like wildfire. The town's defenders, a mismatched collection of Ashfin riders, Havingard soldiers, and armed townsfolk, none of whom had ever trained to fight alongside one another, scrambled to the eastern barricades in the dark, torches guttering, fear and confusion thick in the night air. Elder Grum and Lord Voss, roused from their beds, arrived at the town's makeshift war council still half-dressed, and for a terrible moment it seemed the fragile alliance might crumble entirely under the pressure, each side eyeing the other with old suspicion, even as the true enemy massed beyond the walls. It was David who held the council together, standing atop an overturned cart in the torchlit square, his quiet voice somehow steadying the chaos. These riders want exactly this, he said, loud and clear despite the fear plainly written on his face. They want us to turn on each other in the panic so that whichever side survives blames the other for what happens tonight. We do not have the luxury of that anymore. If we fight divided, we die divided. If we fight together, we have a chance. Elder Grum looked to Lord Voss. Lord Voss, pale but resolute, looked back, and something passed between the two old rivals that had not existed a week before, not friendship, not yet, but a grudging, urgent respect. The clerk is right, Voss said. Ashfin riders to the eastern barricade with my cavalry, townsfolk to the walls with bows. We hold the line together or we do not hold it at all. What followed was the fight David Ramsay would remember for the rest of his life. The impossible, desperate last stand that should never have been survivable. The raiders hit the eastern barricade just before dawn, 60 mounted warriors against a scraped-together defense of perhaps 40 fighters, orc and human shoulder to shoulder for the first time in a generation, torches and lanterns throwing wild shadows across the chaos. David had no sword worth the name and no training for this kind of violence, but he found himself in the thick of it regardless, dragging wounded townsfolk clear of the fighting, shouting directions between the Ashfin riders and Havingard soldiers whose battle calls did not match, translating desperate commands in the space of heartbeats, so that the two forces could actually coordinate instead of simply fighting in parallel. Glacia fought like something out of legend, holding the center of the barricade nearly alone for a terrible stretch when the line began to buckle, her sword, an axe a whirlwind of desperate violence, buying time with her own body for the townsfolk fleeing behind her. David watched, heart in his throat, as three raiders converged on her at once, and without thinking, without any plan beyond raw terror for her safety, he grabbed a fallen spear from the ground and threw himself into the gap beside her, driving the spear's haft into the knee of the nearest attacker with every ounce of desperate strength he had. It was not skill. It was not training. It was simply a man who could not bear to watch the woman he loved die alone, and it bought Glacia the half-second she needed to finish the raider and turn to the next. "Get back," she snarled at him, even as she fought, fear for him plain beneath the fury. "No," David shouted back, bracing the spear against another attacker's charge, his arms screaming with the effort. "Not this time. I'm not standing safely at a distance while you bleed for both of us." For a moment, fighting back to back against odds that should have killed them both, something passed between them that was not quite words, a fierce, wordless understanding that whatever happened next, they would face it together or not at all. The tide of the battle turned not through any single heroic stroke, but through the sheer improbable fact of Ashvin and Havengard fighters finally, truly working as one force, orc strength and human tactics interlocking in a way 60 raiders, however brutal, had not prepared for. Elder Grum himself broke through the raiders' flank with a dozen mounted riders, and Lord Voss's disciplined infantry held the barricade's center long enough for the flanking maneuver to close the trap. By the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, the raiders who survived were fleeing east in scattered disarray, and Bramford Ford, battered and bloodied but standing, had held. David found himself on his knees in the mud afterward, spear still gripped in shaking hands, staring at nothing, the adrenaline draining out of him all at once and leaving him hollow and trembling. Glacia dropped to her knees in front of him, blood spattered and breathing hard, and pulled his face up to look at her with both hands, checking him frantically for wounds. "You absolute, reckless fool," she said, her voice cracking with an emotion too large to be simple anger. "You stood in the center of a battle with a spear you do not know how to use for me." "I told you," David managed, his voice unsteady, "I am done standing safely at a distance from what matters." Glacia made a sound that was half sob, half fierce laugh and kissed him hard, right there in the mud in the aftermath of battle in front of Ashvin riders and Havengard soldiers alike, none of whom in that moment found it strange at all. "I am not losing you," she said fiercely against his mouth. "I already buried one man I loved to this border. I refuse to bury another. Do you understand me, David Ramsay? I refuse it." "Then do not let go of my hand," David said, "and I promise you I have no intention of dying anywhere but old age beside you." Around them, the wounded were gathered, the dead mercifully few, though not none were laid out with equal care regardless of which people they had been born to. And for the first time in living memory, orc and human worked side by side in Bramford Ford, not out of forced necessity at a treaty table, but out of something that had been earned in blood and fear and hard-won trust during the worst night either side had faced together. The attack, investigated in the days that followed with grim thoroughness, was traced back to a disgraced Havengard nobleman who had stood to profit enormously from renewed war along the border. A man named Reston Cray, who had funded the original mercenary raid that killed Karg Darkwolf and orchestrated the fire and the raider assault that followed, all in hopes of seizing contested land through chaos rather than treaty. Lord Voss, humiliated and furious to learn a man of his own court had betrayed the crown's peace so thoroughly, saw to Cray's arrest personally, and delivered the truth of Karg's death to Elder Grum and Glacia with his own hands, an act of honesty that did more to heal the old wound between their peoples than any treaty clause could have. Glacia received the news standing at the edge of the Kestrel River, the same spot where she had first shown David the arrowhead that started this whole desperate chase for truth. She said nothing for a long while, simply staring at the water, and David stood beside her, close but not touching, giving her the space grief demanded. "It does not bring him back," she said, finally quiet, "but it means his death meant something in the end. It brought a truth that might actually hold this piece together longer than the last one did." "He would be proud of you," David said gently, "for chasing that truth all the way here, even when it would have been easier to simply hate and stop asking questions." Glasha turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears she refused, warrior-proud, to let fall. "He would have liked you, I think. Eventually, after he stopped being annoyed that you talk circles around every argument." David laughed softly, and Glasha, after a moment, laughed too, and it was the sound of grief finally beginning to loosen its grip enough to let something new grow in its place. The formal signing of the treaty took place a week later, in the same square where Glasha had first thrown her knife into the negotiating table, though the table itself had been replaced after the fire's damage. The mood was entirely different this time. Not the taut, suspicious hostility of the first meeting, but something cautiously hopeful, forged in shared bloodshed and hard-won honesty. Ashfin riders and Havingard soldiers stood together at the square's edges rather than glowering across a divide, and the crossroads town's ordinary residents, merchants and travelers and tradesfolk of every people, gathered to watch history being made in the mundane, practical shape of a signed parchment rather than another grave. Elder Grum signed first, his weathered hand steady despite his age, followed by Lord Voss, whose humiliation over Cray's betrayal had, remarkably, made him a more honest negotiator than he had ever been before. David stood at the table's side as the treaty's drafter, watching the final terms, the kestrel bend shared fairly between grazing herd and wheat field, a rotating schedule both sides had finally agreed to trust, a joint council to investigate any future violence before either side rushed to blame the other become law with 2 signatures, and a shared cup of wine poured, by old border custom, between orc and human leaders as a sign of peace. Glasha stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, watching, and when the ceremony concluded and the assembled crowd began to cheer, a real, unguarded cheer, orc and human voices mingling in the same relief, she made her way through the press of bodies to where David stood, still slightly stunned by the enormity of what had actually been accomplished. "You did this," she said, stopping in front of him, ignoring the crowd around them entirely. A quiet clerk who talks in circles walked into the middle of 2 furious peoples and found a way to actually heal something that has been broken for 40 years. "We did this," David corrected softly. "I could not have found the truth without you standing beside me demanding it. I could not have held that barricade without you fighting to keep both of us alive. This was never mine alone, Glasha. It was ours." Glasha's expression softened into something David had rarely seen on her fierce, guarded face open, unguarded tenderness, entirely without armor. "I came to this table armed," she said quietly, certain I would find only enemies and grief. "I did not expect to find," she stopped, searching for words, and then simply reached out and took his hand in both of hers, lacing their fingers together in full view of the entire crowded square, Ashfin and Havingard alike watching without a single voice raised in objection. "I did not expect to find you." "I am glad you did," David said, echoing his own words from that first night by the river, and meant them with his entire heart. The crowd around them, sensing something significant unfolding, quieted by degrees, until the square held a hush entirely different from the terrified silence of that first knife-thrown morning. This was the hush of witness, of people watching something rare and true take shape in front of them. "Glasha Darkwolf," David said, his quiet voice somehow carrying across the whole square, steady despite the racing of his heart. "I am aware that I am a poor match by every measure your people or mine might use to judge such things. I have no clan, no great fortune, no warrior's strength to offer you. I have only what I am, a man who left a life of safe distance because he wanted more than anything to stand close to something true. I do not know if that is enough, but I would very much like the chance to find out, for as long as you will have me." Glash's throat worked, and for a moment the fierce orc warrior who had thrown a knife into solid oak without flinching looked, for the first time since David had met her, entirely undone. "Among my people," she said, her voice rough with emotion she made no effort to hide, "there is an old custom. When a warrior chooses a mate not for strength or clan or fortune, but for the truth of who they are, she marks them before witnesses, so that no one may ever doubt the choosing was hers, freely made, and no one else's." She drew her belt knife, the same knife David realized with a jolt that had first struck the treaty table a week ago, and pressed the flat of the blade, cool and gentle, against the back of his hand, an old orc gesture of claiming that the gathered Ashfin riders recognized at once, murmurs of surprise and gradually approval rippling through their ranks. "I choose you, David Ramsay," Glasha said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, her voice steady now, fierce and proud and entirely certain. "Not because you are strong by my people's measure, and not because you are useful to any treaty. I choose you because you stood between two armies with nothing but words and refused to move. I choose you because you chased the truth of my husband's death across dangerous ground for no reward but my trust. I choose you because you put your body between me and a raider's blade with a spear you did not know how to use, because you could not bear to watch me fight alone. I have buried one husband to this border. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life alone at his grave when a braver, gentler man is standing right in front of me, offering me his whole heart without armor." The square erupted, not into violence this time, but into a genuine, startled cheer, Ashfin riders and Havingard soldiers and Bramford Ford townsfolk alike, caught up in the rare, unguarded joy of watching two impossible people find each other across every old hatred that should have kept them apart. David, his own eyes bright now, lifted Glasha's hand, the hand still holding the knife against his skin, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, gentle and reverent. "Then I accept the claiming," he said, "and I offer you mine in return, for whatever a quiet man's heart is worth to a warrior like you." "It is worth everything," Glasha said fiercely, sheathing her knife and pulling him instead into her arms, kissing him deeply and without any restraint at all in front of the cheering crowd, "because it is yours, and I have decided I intend to keep it." That evening, as the crossroads town of Bramford Ford celebrated the signed treaty with bonfires and shared food between peoples who had, only 2 weeks before, glared at each other across an unbridgeable divide, David and Glasha slipped away from the noise to the same flat gray stone by the river where their strange courtship had first properly begun. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold and endless, and the kestrel murmured past exactly as it always had, indifferent to the small, enormous miracle that had unfolded on its banks. "I was so certain," Glasha admitted quietly, her head resting against David's shoulder, his arm around her, "that I would leave this crossroads with nothing but a signed parchment and the same hollow grief I arrived with. I did not think there was room left in me for anything else. Karg's death had burned so much of it away. Grief does not leave room for much of anything, until suddenly it does," David said softly. "I do not think I am asking you to forget him, Glasha. I would not want that, even if it were possible. I think I am only asking for the space beside that grief, if you will let me stand there." Glasha turned her head to look at him, her expression open and unguarded in a way that would have seemed impossible the day her knife struck the treaty table. "You have already been standing there for 2 weeks, David Ramsay," she said. "I simply did not have the words for it until tonight." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the bonfire's distant glow and laughter drifting on the night wind from the town behind them, until Glasha finally rose, pulling David up with her, her hand warm and certain around his. "Come," she said. I did not travel this far, armed and grieving, to spend my first night of real peace sitting on a cold rock discussing feelings like a philosopher. I have decided what I want, clerk, and it is not more talking." David laughed, startled and delighted, and let her lead him back toward the lantern-lit town, her hand never once loosening its grip on his. And if anyone in Bramford Ford that night noticed the orc widow and the quiet diplomat disappearing together into the warm dark, laughing softly, utterly wrapped up in each other, no one thought to comment on it at all, because by then, the whole crossroads had already seen enough of their story to understand exactly what it meant, and to wish them nothing but well. In the weeks that followed, the treaty held not perfectly, because no peace built by imperfect people ever holds perfectly, but well enough that the Kestrel Bend saw both grazing herds and growing wheat that season, and Bramford Ford settled into a wary, hopeful sort of coexistence that had not seemed possible before David Ramsay stood unarmed between two furious camps and refused to move. Elder Grum and Lord Voss, though never quite friends, developed a grudging respect for one another that outlasted the negotiations entirely, and Corbin Hale was sent home from Havingard in disgrace, a small but real sign that the old prejudices, while not gone, no longer went unanswered. Glacia Darkwolf did not return to the Ashfin war camp when the Treaty Commission's business concluded. Instead, she and David built a small home together at the edge of Bramford Ford, close enough to the crossroads that David could continue his work mediating the endless small disputes that sprang up between the many peoples who passed through the town, and close enough to the river that Glacia could ride out along the Kestrel Bend whenever she needed to feel close to Karg's memory, tending it not with grief alone anymore, but with a hard-won peace she had helped secure with her own hands. She kept her travel leathers, her sword, her hand axe. She was not a woman who set aside her strength for any man, nor did David ever ask her to, but she wore them now not as armor against a hostile world, but as the clothes of a warrior who had chosen, at last, to stop merely surviving and start truly living. And when David worked late into the evening drafting some new small treaty or boundary agreement for the crossroads town's endless disputes, Glacia would often sit across from him exactly as she had that first tense afternoon, though now she leaned over his shoulder not to challenge his lines, but to press a kiss to his temple, warm and easy and entirely certain of her welcome. "You are still redrawing the same boundary 4 times, she told him once, months later, laughing softly against his hair. "Some things, it seems, never change." "Some things," David agreed, turning his head to catch her mouth with his own, "I would not want to change for anything in this world." Outside their small home, the crossroads town of Bramford Ford carried on its restless, hopeful business, caravans rolling through from every direction, orc and human and dwarf, and traveler of every kind haggling and laughing and building, slowly, a peace that had begun with a knife thrown into a treaty table, and ended with a warrior's claiming knife pressed gentle against a quiet man's hand. And in the small home at the crossroads edge, Glacia Darkwolf, once a widow armed with nothing but grief and fury, and David Ramsay, once a forgettable clerk who had spent his whole life standing at careful distances from everything that mattered, held on to each other in the lantern light, chosen and choosing, entirely and completely no longer alone.